Philippians 2, and of course following following hot on the heels of Norman last week, who was looking at verses 1 to 11, I think, well, taking the other week into consideration as well, and then last week he was looking at verses 5 to 11, and particularly last week examining this idea of the Lord Jesus as a servant, that he emptied himself of his glory and became a servant and became obedient unto death, as it says, even the death of the cross. And so I just wanted to just kind of tie it in with what we looked at last week, so that it just refreshes our memory. That's what we were looking at, because now what the Apostle Paul does in these next few verses that we're going to read is he starts to compare the Philippians with Christ. He starts to use this example of Christ and if you like, transfer that now to the Philippians. So what we'll do is we're going to read from Philippians 2 from verse 12 through to verse 18. 1, 2, 3, 4, 6, 7. And there's just enough of us to do that. So if I start here, again, anybody who doesn't want to read, you've got the wrong glasses with you, or you've lost your voice, then fine, somebody will take that up. But I'll start at verse 12 of Philippians chapter 2. We'll go that way around. Wherefore, my beloved, as ye have always obeyed, not as in my presence only, but now much more in my absence, work out your own salvation with fear and trembling.
For it is God which worketh in you both, to will and to do of his good pleasure.
Do everything without complaining or arguing,
that ye may be blameless and harmless, the sons of God without rebuke, in the midst of a crooked and perverse nation, among whom ye shine as lights in the world,
holding forth the word of life, that I may rejoice in the day of Christ, that I have not run in vain, neither laboured in vain.
But even if I am being poured out as a libation over the sacrifice and offering of your faith, I am glad and rejoice with all of you.
For the same cause also do ye joy and rejoice with me. Okay. So a few different translations there. Interesting, isn't it, when you hear how the others put it? Everyone's saying how hard the King James is to read. I don't know whether it really is.
I think this time there was a word harder in Rachel's than in
King
James.
Libation.
Oh, is it libation? Sorry, I was libation.
Yeah. So.
I'm not sure I've heard it before.
Yeah. Although it's not too far off what it's saying. But anyway, we'll come to that eventually. So we're looking at the as I said, comparing the obedience of Christ now with the obedience of the Philippians. And if we go back to verse 8 of chapter 2, I just want to cover something that Norman obviously did for us last week. So Philippians 2 verse 8, my version says, and being found in fashion as a man, he humbled himself and became obedient unto death, even the death of the cross. And so it's this idea of obedience now that the Apostle Paul starts to deal with. Now, is Paul suggesting that if you're a Christian, you must walk as Jesus walked? Is he saying that? Is that not just like too much of a tall order? That surely he understands. We're not perfect. We have these faults and so on. Is he really suggesting that we take Christ here as our example? Well, I'm going to let the Bible answer that question. If you turn to the first epistle of John, 1 John, and it's chapter 2. Oops, gone the wrong way. 1 John.
Is it forwards or backwards?
Oof.
Give me a number.
It's well, it depends which way you look at it.
Forward.
Yeah, 1 John.
So towards the end of
Backwards
your
in that
Bible.
case. Backwards in that case.
That's what I mean. It's
The other way. The other way. 1 John.
1 John.
Oh,
Yeah, 1 John. 1 John, chapter 2. And verse 6. Paul, would you read that verse for us, please?
Just 6,
Yeah, just verse 6.
He that saith he abideth in him ought himself also so to walk, even as he walked.
Yes. So if you say you abide in him, him being Christ, then he ought himself also to walk even as he walked. So yes, we are called to walk as Christ walked, with the same obedience that he showed, as Paul recounts here in Philippians, being obedient unto death, even the death of the cross, even a shameful death, as it would have been seen by people at the time, even the kind of punishment that was a humiliating punishment, a humiliating death. Yes, we are called to follow in his footsteps, to be a servant as he was a servant, and simply to continue like that, even if it means our death. So Paul is now starting to take that example of Jesus and saying, yeah, this is what we are expected to do. And verse 12, he says, wherefore, my beloved, as ye have always obeyed, it means whilst Paul was with them, they were obedient. Whilst they had that salvation in God, they were obedient. Not as in my presence only, but now, he says, now much more in my absence. So Paul is saying, look, when I go away, I want you to continue the obedience that you've had whilst I was present. And I think this is the really difficult thing as a Christian. In some ways, when you're at church, or when you're surrounded by other Christians, particularly if you have a mature Christian that you're being, I don't like the word mentor, but being discipled by, it's sort of easier, I found, particularly as a young Christian, it's easier to be obedient to Christ and to live and to walk as you should walk. But it's when you come away from all that, when you're in, say, a work situation or a family situation or something like that, that is when I think it's hard to be obedient, to walk as Christ walked. That's the real challenge, I think. And I think this is the challenge that Paul is talking about. And he's trying to encourage them. He's saying, look, you have always obeyed, but now, much more in my absence, you've got to have that same obedience. And this is what the apostles had. It didn't matter where they were or who they were with, they were always the same person, weren't they? You read the lives of Paul and John and so on. I mean, I was going to say Peter, but perhaps Peter is an exception because, of course, we read in Antioch that he actually does change his behaviour. He starts to separate himself from the Gentiles, and again being influenced by the Judaizers. And it takes Paul to reprove him for that, but then he's, I believe he's restored after it. But that's the danger, isn't it? That depending on who you're with, you can change your behaviour. So whilst you're in a church situation, whilst you're with other Christians, you're bold, you're full of joy, you want to talk about the Bible and so on. But when you're in a different situation, work, family, maybe just out in town and so on, are you the same?